Part 2, Chapter 17 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 2, Chapter 17. The departure from the house was interrupted by an unforeseen cause of delay. Jack refused to follow the hearse with Dr. Dormann and Mr. Keller. "I won't lose sight of her," he cried. "No, not for a moment. Of all living creatures, I must be the first to see her when she wakes." Mr. Keller turned to the doctor. "What does he mean?" The doctor, standing back in the shadow of the house, seemed to have some reason for not answering otherwise than by gesture. He touched his forehead significantly, and stepping out into the road, took Jack by the hand. The canopy of the hearse, closed at the sides, was open at either end. From the driver's seat the couch became easily visible on looking round. With inexhaustible patience the doctor quieted the rising excitement in Jack, and gained him permission to take his place by the driver's side. Always grateful for kindness, he thanked Dr. Dormann, with the tears falling fast over his cheeks. "I'm not crying for her," said the poor little man. "She will soon be herself again. But it's so dreadful, sir, to go out driving with her in such a carriage as this." The hearse moved away. Dr. Dormann, walking with Mr. Keller, felt his arm touched, and looking round saw the dimly outlined figure of a woman beckoning to him. He drew back after a word of apology to his companion, who continued to follow the hearse. The woman met him halfway. He recognized Madame Fontaine. "You are a learned man," she began abruptly. "Do you understand writing in cipher?" "Sometimes." "If you have half an hour to spare this evening, look at that, and do me the favor of telling me what it means." She offered something to him, which appeared in the dim light to be only a sheet of paper. He hesitated to take it from her. She tried to press it on him. "I found this among my husband's papers," she said. "He was a great chemist, as you know. It might be interesting to you." He still hesitated. "Are you acquainted with chemical science?" he asked. "I am perfectly ignorant of chemical science." "Then what interest can you have in interpreting the cipher?" "I have a very serious interest. There may be something dangerous in it if it fell into unscrupulous hands. I want to know if I ought to destroy it." He suddenly took the paper from her. It felt stiff, like a sheet of cartridge paper. "You shall hear," he said. "In case of necessity, I will destroy it myself. Anything more?" "One thing more. Does Jack go to the cemetery with you and Mr. Keller?" "Yes." Walking away rapidly to overtake Mr. Keller, he looked behind him once or twice. The street was dimly lit in those days by a few oil lamps. He might be mistaken, but he thought that Madame Fontaine was following him. On leaving the city, the lanterns were lit to guide the hearse along the road that led to the cemetery. The overseer met the bearers at the gates. They passed under a Doric portico into a central hall. At its right-hand extremity an open door revealed a room for the accommodation of mourners. Beyond this there was a courtyard, and farther still the range of apartments devoted to the residence of the cemetery overseer. Turning from the right-hand division of the building, the bearers led the way to the opposite extremity of the hall. passed through a second room for mourners, crossed a second courtyard beyond it, and turning into a narrow passage, knocked at a closed door. The door was opened by a watchman. He admitted them into a long room situated between the courtyard at one end and the cemetery at the other, and having 10 side recesses which opened out of it. The long room was the watchman's chamber. The recesses were the cells which held the dead. The couch was set down in the watchman's chamber. It was a novelty in the dead house, and the overseer asked for an explanation. Dr. Dormann informed him that the change had been made with his full approval to satisfy a surviving friend, and that the coffin would be provided before the certificate was granted for the burial. While the persons present were all gathered round the doctor and the overseer, Madame Fontaine softly pushed open the door from the courtyard. After a look at the recesses, situated 5 on either side of the length of the room, and closed by black curtains, she parted the curtains of the nearest recess to her on her left hand, and stepped in without being noticed by anyone. "You take the responsibility of the couch, doctor, if the authorities raise any objection," said the overseer. This condition being complied with, he addressed himself to the watchman. "The cells are all empty to-night, Duntzer, are they not?" "Yes, sir." "Are you off duty early or late this evening?" "I'm off duty in half an hour, sir." The overseer pointed to the couch. "You can attend to this," he said. "Take the cell that is nearest to you, where the watchman's chair is placed, number 5. He referred to the 5th recess at the upper end of the room on the right, counting from the courtyard door. The watchman looped up the black curtains, while the bearers placed the couch in the cell. This done, the bearers were dismissed. Dr. Dormann pointed through the parted curtains to the lofty cell, ventilated from the top, and warmed, like the watchman's chamber, by an apparatus under the flooring. In the middle of the cell was a stand placed there to support the coffin. Above the stand a horizontal bar projected, which was fixed over the doorway. It was furnished with a pulley, through which passed a long thin string hanging loosely downward at one end, and attached at the other to a small alarm bell, placed over the door on the other side, that is to say, on the side of the watchman's chamber. "All the cells are equal in size," said the doctor to Mr. Keller, "and are equally clean and well warmed. The hot bath in another room is always ready, and a cabinet filled with restorative applications is close by. Now look at the watchman, and mark the care that is taken in the event, for instance, of a cataleptic trance, and of a revival following it." Duntzer led the way into the cell. He took the loose end of the string hanging from above, and attached it to 2 shorter and lighter strings, each of which terminated in 5 loose ends. From these 10 ends hung 10 little thimble-shaped objects made of brass. First, slightly altering the position of the couch on the stand, Duntzer lifted the dead hands, fitted the 10 brass thimbles to the fingers and the thumbs, and gently laid the hands back on the breast of the corpse. When he had looked up, and had satisfied himself of the exact connection between the hands and the line communicating with the alarm bell outside, his duty was done. He left the cell, and seating himself in his chair, awaited the arrival of the night watchman who was to relieve him. Mr. Keller came out into the chamber, and spoke to the overseer. "Is all done now?" "All is done." "I should like, while I am here, to speak to you about the grave." The overseer bowed. "You can see the plan of the cemetery," he said, "in my office on the other side of the building." Mr. Keller looked back into the cell. Jack had taken his place in it when the couch had been carried in, and Dr. Dormann was quietly observing him. Mr. Keller beckoned to Jack. "I am waiting for you," he said. "Come." "And leave mistress?" Jack answered. "Never!" Mr. Keller was on the point of stepping into the cell when Dr. Dormann took his arm and led him away out of hearing. "I want to ask you a question," said the doctor. "Was that poor creature's madness violent madness when Mrs. Wagner took him out of the London asylum?" "I have heard her say so." "Be careful what you do with him. Mrs. Wagner's death has tried his weak brain seriously. I am afraid of a relapse into that violent madness. Leave him to me." Mr. Keller left the room with the overseer. Dr. Dormann returned to the cell. "Listen to me, Jack," he said. "If your mistress revives, as you think, I want you to see for yourself how she will tell it to the man who is on the watch." He turned and spoke to Duntzer. "Is the alarm bell set?" "Yes, sir." The doctor addressed himself once more to Jack. "Now look and listen," he said. He delicately touched one of the brass thimbles fitted to the fingers of the corpse. The bell rang instantly in the watchman's chamber. "The moment the man hears that," he resumed, "he will make the signal which calls the overseer and the nurses to help your mistress back to life. At the same time, a messenger will be sent to Mr. Keller's house to tell you what has happened. You see how well she is taken care of, and you will behave sensibly, I am sure. I am going away. Come with me." Jack answered as he had answered Mr. Keller. "Never!" he said. He flung himself on the floor, and clasped his arms round one of the pillars supporting the stand on which the couch was placed. "Tear me arms out of their sockets!" he cried. "You won't get me away till you've done that." Before the doctor could answer, footsteps were heard in the watchman's chamber. A jolly voice asked a question. "Any report for the night, Duntzer?" Jack seemed to recognize the voice. He looked round eagerly. "A corpse in number 5," Duntzer answered, "and strangers in the cell, contrary to the order for the night, as you know. I have reported them. It's your duty to send them away. Good night." A red-nosed old man looked in at the doorway of the cell. Jack started to his feet. "Here's Schwartz!" he cried. "Leave me with Schwartz!" End of chapter 17 of part 2.
Part 2, Chapter 18 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 2, Chapter 18. The discovery of Jack agreeably surprised Schwartz without in the least perplexing him. His little friend, as he reasoned, had no doubt remembered the invitation to the Deadhouse, and had obtained admission through the interference of the strange gentleman who was with him. But who was the gentleman? The deputy night watchman, though he might carry messages for his relative the nurse, was not personally acquainted with his sister's medical patrons in Frankfurt. He looked at the doctor with an expression of considerable doubt. "I beg your pardon, sir," he ventured to say. "You're not a member of the City Council, are you?" "I have nothing to do with the City Council." "And nothing to do with managing the Deadhouse?" "Nothing. I am Dr. Dormann." Schwartz snapped his clumsy fingers as an appropriate expression of relief. "All right, sir. Leave the little man with me. I'll take care of him." "Do you know this person?" asked the doctor, turning to Jack. Yes, leave me here with him," Jack answered eagerly. "Good night, sir, good night." Dr. Dormann looked again at Jack's friend. "I thought strangers were not allowed here at night," he said. "It's against the rules," Schwartz admitted. "But Lord love you, sir, think of the dullness of this place. Besides, I'm only a deputy. In 3 nights more the regular man will come on duty again. It's an awful job, Doctor, watching alone here all night. One of the men actually went mad and hanged himself. To be sure, he was a poet in his way, which makes it less remarkable. I'm not a poet myself. I'm only a sociable creature. Leave little Jack with me. I'll send him home safe and sound. I feel like a father to him." The doctor hesitated. What was he to do? Jack had already returned to the cell in which his mistress lay. To remove him by the brutal exercise of main force was a proceeding from which Dr. Dormann's delicacy of feeling naturally recoiled, to say nothing of the danger of provoking that outbreak of madness against which the doctor had himself warned Mr. Keller. Persuasion he had already tried in vain. Delegated authority to control Jack had not been conferred on him. There seemed to be no other course than to yield. "If you persist in your obstinacy," he said to Jack, "I must return alone to Mr. Keller's house, and tell him that I have left you here with your friend." Jack was already absorbed in his own thoughts. He only repeated vacantly, "Good night." Dr. Dormann left the room. Schwartz looked at his guest. "Wait there for the present," he said. "The porter will be here directly. I don't want him to see you." The porter came in after an interval. "All right for the night?" he asked. "All right," Schwartz answered. The porter withdrew in silence. The night watchman's reply was his authority for closing the gates of the dead house until the next morning. Schwartz returned to Jack, still watching patiently by the side of the couch. "Was she a relation of yours?" he asked. "All the relations in the world to me," Jack burst out passionately. "Father and mother, and brother and sister and wife." "Aye, aye. 5 relations in one is what I call an economical family," said Schwartz. "Come out here to the table. You stood treat last time. It's my turn now. I've got some wine handy. Yes, she was a fine woman in her time, I dare say. Why haven't you put her in a coffin like other people?" "Why?" Jack repeated indignantly. "I couldn't prevent them from bringing her here, but I could have burnt the house down over their heads if they had dared to put her into a coffin. Are you stupid enough to suppose that mistress is dead? Don't you know that I am watching and waiting here till she wakes? Ah, I beg your pardon. You don't know. The rest of them would have let her die. I have saved her life. Come here, and I'll tell you how." He dragged Schwartz into the cell. As the watchman disappeared from view, the wild white face of Madame Fontaine appeared between the curtains of her hiding-place, listening to Jack's narrative of the opening of the cupboard and the discovery that had followed. Schwartz humoured his little friend, evidently, as he now concluded, his crazy little friend, by listening in respectful silence. Instead of making any remark at the end, he mentioned once more that the wine was handy. "Come," he reiterated, "come to the table." Madame Fontaine drew back again behind the curtains. Jack remained obstinately in the cell. "I mean to see it," he said, "the moment she moves." "Do you think your eyes will tell you?" Schwartz remonstrated. "You look dead beat already. Your eyes will get tired. Trust the bell there over the door. Brass and steel don't get tired. Brass and steel don't fall asleep. Brass and steel will ring and call you to her. Take a rest and drink." These words reminded Jack of the doctor's experiment with the alarm bell. He could not disguise from himself the stealthily growing sense of fatigue in his head and his limbs. "I'm afraid you're right," he said sadly. "I wish I was a stronger man." He joined Schwartz at the table and dropped wearily into the watchman's chair. His head sank on his breast, his eyes closed. He started up again. "She may want help when she wakes," he cried with a look of terror. "What must we do? Can we carry her home between us? Oh, Schwartz, I was so confident in myself a little while since, and it seems all to have left me now." "Don't worry that weary little head of yours about nothing," Schwartz answered with a rough good nature. "Come along with me, and I'll show you how help's to be got when help's wanted. No, you won't be out of hearing of the bell if it rings. We'll leave the door open. It's only on the other side of the passage here." He lighted a lantern and led Jack out. Leaving the courtyard and the waiting room on their left hand, he advanced along the right-hand side of the passage, and opened the door of a bed-chamber, always kept ready for use. A second door in the bed-chamber led to a bathroom. Here, opposite the bath, stood the cabinet in which the restorative applications were kept, under the care of the overseer. When the two men had gone out, Madame Fontaine ventured to the watchman's chamber. Her eyes turned towards the one terrible cell, at the farther end of the row of black curtains. She advanced towards it, and stopped, lifting her hands to her head in a desperate effort to compose herself. The terror of impending discovery had never left her, since Jack had owned the use to which he had put the contents of the blue glass bottle. Animated by that all-mastering dread, she had thrown away every poison in the medicine chest, and broken the bottles into fragments, and had taken those fragments out with her, when she left the house to follow Dr. Dorman. On the way to the cemetery she had scattered the morsels of broken glass and torn paper on the dark road outside the city gate. Nothing now remained but the empty medicine chest, and the writing in cipher once rolled round the poison called the looking-glass drops. Under these altered circumstances she had risked asking Dr. Dorman to interpret the mysterious characters, on the bare chance of their containing some warning by which she might profit, in her present ignorance of the results which Jack's ignorant interference might produce. Acting under the same vague terror of that possible revival to which Jack looked forward with such certain hope, she had followed him to the dead-house, and had waited, hidden in the cells, to hear what dangerous confidences he might repose in the doctor or in Mr. Keller, and to combat on the spot the suspicion which he might ignorantly rouse in their minds. Still in the same agony of doubt, she now stood with her eyes on the cell, trying to summon the resolution to judge for herself. One look at the dead woman, while the solitude of the room gave her the chance, one look might assure her of the livid pallor of death, or warn her of the terrible possibilities of awakening life. She hurried headlong over the intervening space and looked in. There, grand and still, lay her murderous work. There, ghostly white on the ground of the black robe, were the rigid hands, topped by the hideous machinery which was to betray them, if they trembled under the mysterious return of life. In the instant when she saw it, the sight overwhelmed her with horror. She turned distractedly and fled through the open door, and crossed the courtyard like a deeper shadow creeping swiftly through the darkness of the winter night. On the threshold of the solitary waiting-room, exhausted nature claimed its rest. She wavered, groped with her hands at the empty air, and sank insensible on the floor. In the meantime Schwartz revealed the purpose of his visit to the bathroom. The glass doors which protected the upper division of the cabinet were locked, the key being in the possession of the overseer. The cupboard in the lower division, containing towels and flannel wrappers, was left unsecured. Opening the door, the watchman drew out a bottle and an old travelling flask concealed behind the bath linen. "I call this my cellar," he explained. "Cheer up, Jackie. We'll have a jolly night of it yet." "I don't want to see your cellar," said Jack impatiently. "I want to be of use to Mistress. Show me the place where we can call for help." "Call?" repeated Schwartz with a roar of laughter. "Do you think they can hear us at the overseer's, through a courtyard and a waiting-room and a grand hall and another courtyard and another waiting-room beyond? Not if we were 20 men all bawling together till we were hoarse. I'll show you how we can make the master hear us, if that miraculous revival of yours happens," he added facetiously in a whisper to himself. He led the way back into the passage, and held up his lantern so as to show the cornice. A row of fire buckets was suspended there by hooks. Midway between them a stout rope hung through a metal-lined hole in the roof. "Do you see that?" said Schwartz. "You only have to pull, and there's an iron tongue in the belfry above that will speak loud enough to be heard at the city gate. The overseer will come tumbling in, with his bunch of keys, as if the devil was at his heels, and the 2 women servants after him, old and ugly, Jack. They attend to the bath, you know, when a woman wants it." Wait a bit. Take a light to the bedroom and get a chair for yourself. We haven't much accommodation for evening visitors. Got it? That's right. Would you like to see where the mad watchman hung himself? On the last hook at the end of that row there. We've got a song he made about the dead house. I think it's in the drawer of the table. A gentleman had it printed and sold for the benefit of the widow and children. Wait till we are well warmed with our liquor, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll sing you the mad watchman's song. And Jackie, my man, you shall sing the chorus. To-ro-rub-a-dub-boom. That's the tune. Part 2, Chapter 19 of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tig Hines. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Part 2, Chapter 19. Jack looked eagerly into the cell again. There was no change, not a sign of that happy waking in which he so firmly believed. Schwartz opened the drawer of the table. Tobacco and pipes, 2 or 3 small drinking glasses, a dirty pack of playing cards, the mad watchman's song, and a woodcut illustration of the suicide, all lay huddled together. He took from the drawer the song and 2 of the drinking glasses, and called to his little guest to come out of the cell. "There," he said, filling the glasses. "You've never tasted such wine as that in all your life. Off with it." Jack turned away with a look of disgust. "What did you say of wine, when I drank it with you the other night?" he asked reproachfully. "You said it would warm my heart and make a man of me. And what did it do? I couldn't stand on my legs. I couldn't hold up my head. I was so sleepy and stupid that Joseph had to take me upstairs to bed. I hate your wine. Your wine's a liar who promises and does not perform. I'm weary enough and wretched enough in my mind as it is. No more wine for me." "Wrong," remarked Schwartz, emptying his glass and smacking his lips after it. "You made a serious mistake the other night. You didn't drink half enough. Give the good liquor a fair chance, my son. No, you won't? Must I try a little gentle persuasion before you will come back to your chair?" Suiting the action to the word, he put his arm round Jack. "What's this I feel under my hand?" he asked. "A bottle?" He took it out of Jack's breast pocket. "Lord help us!" he exclaimed. "It looks like physic." Jack snatched it away from him with a cry of delight. "The very thing for me, and I never thought of it." It was the phial which Madame Fontaine had repentantly kept to herself, after having expressly filled it for him with the fatal dose of Alexander's wine, the phial which he had found when he first opened the pink room cupboard. In the astonishment and delight of finding the blue glass bottle immediately afterwards, he had entirely forgotten it. Nothing had since happened to remind him that it was in his pocket, until Schwartz had stumbled on the discovery. "It cures you when you're tired or troubled in your mind," Jack announced in his grandest manner, repeating Madame Fontaine's own words. "Is there any water here?" "Not a drop, thank heaven," said Schwartz devoutly. "Give me my glass, then. I once tried the remedy by itself, and it stung me as it went down. The wine won't hurt me with this splendid stuff in it. I'll take it in the wine." "Who told you to take it?" Schwartz asked, holding back the glass. "Mrs. Housekeeper told me." "A woman!" growled Schwartz, in a tone of sovereign contempt. "How dare you let a woman physic you when you've got me for a doctor? Jack, I'm ashamed of you." Jack defended his manhood. "Oh, I don't care what she says. I despise her. She's mad. You don't suppose she made this? I wouldn't touch it if she had. No, her husband made it. A wonderful man, the greatest man in Germany." He reached across the table and secured his glass of wine. Before it was possible to interfere, he had emptied the contents of the phial into it, and had raised it to his lips. At that moment Schwartz's restraining hand had found its way to his wrist. The deputy watchman had far too sincere a regard for good wine to permit it to be drunk in combination with physic at his own table. "Put it down," he said gruffly. "You're my visitor, ain't you? Do you think I'm going to let housekeeper's catlap be drunk at my table? Look here." He held up his travelling flask with the metal drinking cup taken off, so as to show the liquor through the glass. The rich amber colour of it fascinated Jack. He put his wine-glass back on the table. "What is it?" he asked eagerly. "Drinkable gold, Jack. My physic. Brandy." He poured out a dram into the metal cup. "Try that," he said, "and don't let me hear any more about the housekeeper's physic." Jack tasted it. The water came into his eyes. He put his hands on his throat. "Fire!" he gasped faintly. "Wait," said Schwartz. Jack waited. The fiery grip of the brandy relaxed. The genial warmth of it was wafted through him persuasively from head to foot. He took another sip. His eyes began to glitter. "What divine being made this?" he asked. Without waiting to be answered, he tried it again, and emptied the cup. "More!" he cried. "I never felt so big, I never felt so strong, I never felt so clever as I feel now." Schwartz, drinking freely from his own bottle, recovered, and more than recovered, his bacchanalian good humour. He clapped Jack on the shoulder. "Who's the right doctor now?" he asked cheerfully. "A drab of a housekeeper, or Father Schwartz? Your health, my jolly boy. When the bottle's empty, I'll help you finish the flask. Drink away, and the devil take all heel-taps." The next dose of brandy fired Jack's excitable brain with a new idea. He fell on his knees at the table and clasped his hands in a sudden fervour of devotion. "Silence!" he commanded sternly. "Your wine's only a poor devil. Your drinkable gold is a god. Take your cap off, Schwartz. I'm worshipping drinkable gold." Schwartz, highly diverted, threw his cap up to the ceiling. "Drinkable gold, ora pro nobis," he shouted, profanely adapting himself to Jack's humour. "You shall be Pope, my boy, and I'll be the Pope's butler. Allow me to help your sacred majesty back to your chair." Jack's answer betrayed another change in him. His tones were lofty, his manner was distant. "I prefer the floor," he said. "Hand me down my mug." As he reached up to take it, the alarm bell over the door caught his eye. Debased as he was by the fiery strength of the drink, his ineradicable love for his mistress made its noble influence felt through the coarse fumes that were mounting to his brain. "Stop!" he cried. "I must be where I can see the bell. I must be ready for her the instant it rings." He crawled across the floor and seated himself with his back against the wall of one of the empty cells, on the left-hand side of the room. Schwartz, shaking his fat sides with laughter, handed down the cup to his guest. Jack took no notice of it. His eyes, reddened already by the brandy, were fixed on the bell opposite to him. "I want to know about it," he said. "What's that steel thing there, under the brass cover?" "What's the use of asking?" Schwartz replied, returning to his bottle. "I want to know." "Patience, Jack, patience. Follow my forefinger. My hand seems to shake a little, but it's as honest a hand as ever was. That steel thing there is the bell hammer, you know, and bless my heart, the hammer's everything. Cost Lord knows how much. Another toast, my son. Good luck to the bell." Jack changed again. He began to cry. "She's sleeping too long on that sofa in there," he said sadly. "I want her to speak to me. I want to hear her scold me for drinking in this horrid place. My heart's all cold again. Where's the mug?" He found it as he spoke. The fire of the brandy went down his throat once more, and lashed him into frantic high spirits. "I'm up in the clouds," he shouted. "I'm riding on a whirlwind. Sing, Schwartz. Ah, there are the stars twinkling through the skylight. Sing the stars down from heaven." Schwartz emptied his bottle, without the ceremony of using the glass. "Now we are primed," he said. "Now for the mad watchman's song." He snatched up the paper from the table and roared out hoarsely the first verse. "The moon was shining cold and bright in the Frankfurt Deadhouse on New Year's night, and I was the watchman left alone, while the rest to feast and dance were gone. I envied their lot and cursed my own, poor me. Chorus, Jack! I envy their lot and curse my own. The last words of the verse were lost in a yell of drunken terror. Schwartz started out of his chair and pointed, panic-stricken, to the lower end of the room. "A ghost!" he screamed. "A ghost in black at the door!" Jack turned round and burst out laughing. "Sit down, you old fool," he said. "It's only Mrs. Housekeeper. We are singing, Mrs. Housekeeper. You haven't heard my voice yet. I'm the finest singer in Germany." Madame Fontaine approached him humbly. "You have a kind heart, Jack. I am sure you will help me," she said. "Show me how to get out of this frightful place." "The devil take you," growled Schwartz, recovering himself. "How did you get in?" "She's a witch," shouted Jack. "She rode in on a broomstick. She crept in through the keyhole. Where's the fire? Let's take her downstairs and burn her." Schwartz applied himself to the brandy flask and began to laugh again. "There was never such good company as Jack," he said in his oiliest tones. "You can't get out tonight, Mrs. Witch. The gates are locked, and they don't trust me with the key. Walk in, madam. Plenty of accommodation for you on that side of the room where Jack sits. We're slack of guests for the grave tonight. Walk in." She renewed her entreaties. "I'll give you all the money I have about me. Who can I go to for the key? Jack, speak for me." "Go on with the song," cried Jack. She appealed again in her despair to Schwartz. "Oh, sir, have mercy on me. I fainted out there, and when I came to myself I tried to open the gates, and I called, and nobody heard me." Schwartz's sense of humour was tickled by this. "If you could bellow like a bull," he said, "nobody would hear you. Take a seat, ma'am." "Go on with the song," reiterated Jack. "I'm tired of waiting." Madame Fontaine looked wildly from one to the other of them. "Oh, God, I'm locked in with an idiot and a drunkard." The thought of it maddened her as it crossed her mind. Once more she fled from the room. Again and again in the outer darkness she shrieked for help. Schwartz advanced staggering towards the door, with Jack's empty chair in his hand. "Perhaps you will be able to pipe a little higher, ma'am, if you come back and sit down. Now for the song, Jack." He burst out with the second verse. "Backwards and forwards with silent tread I walked on my watch by the doors of the dead. And I said, it's hard on this new year, while the rest are dancing, to leave me here, alone with death and cold and fear. Poor me. Chorus, Jack! Chorus, Mrs. Housekeeper! Ha! Look at her! She can't resist the music. She's come back to us already. What can we do for you, ma'am? The flask's not quite drained yet. Come, have a drink." She had returned, recoiling from the outer darkness and silence, giddy with the sickening sense of faintness which was creeping over her again. When Schwartz spoke, she advanced with tottering steps. "Water!" she exclaimed, gasping for breath. "I'm faint. Water! Water!" "Not a drop in the place, madam. Brandy, if you like." "I forbid it," cried Jack, with a peremptory sign of the hand. The glass of wine which Schwartz had prevented him from drinking caught his notice. To give Madame Fontaine her own remedy, stolen from her own room, was just the sort of trick to please Jack in his present humour. He pointed to the glass and winked at the watchman. After a momentary hesitation, Schwartz's muddled brain absorbed the new idea. "Here's a drop of wine left, ma'am," he said. "Suppose you try it." She leaned one hand on the table to support herself. Her heart sank lower and lower. A cold perspiration bedewed her face. "Quick, quick!" she murmured faintly. She seized the glass and emptied it eagerly to the last drop. Schwartz and Jack eyed her with malicious curiosity. The idea of getting away was still in her mind. "I think I can walk now," she said. "For God's sake, let me out." "Haven't I told you already? I can't get out myself." At that brutal answer she shrank back. Slowly and feebly she made her way to the chair and dropped on it. "Cheer up, ma'am," said Schwartz. "You shall have more music to help you. You shall hear how the mad watchman lost his wits. Another drop of drinkable gold, Jack. A dram for you and a dram for me, and here goes." He roared out the last verses of the song. Any company's better than none, I said. If I can't have the living, I'd like the dead. In one terrific moment more, the corpse bell rang at each cell door. The moonlight shivered on the floor. Poor me. The curtains gaped. There stood a ghost on every threshold, as white as frost. You called us. They shrieked. We gathered soon. Dance with your guests by the New Year's moon. I danced till I dropped in a deadly swoon. Poor me. And since that night I've lost my wits, and I shake with ceaseless ague fits. For the ghosts, they turned me cold as stone, on that New Year's night when the white moon shone, and I walked on my watch all alone. Poor me. And oh, when I lie in my coffin bed, heap thick the earth above my head, or I shall come back and dance once more, with frantic feet on the dead house floor, and a ghost for my partner at every door. Poor me. The night had cleared. While Schwartz was singing, the moon shone in at the skylight. At the last verse of the song, a ray of the cold yellow light streamed across Jack's face. The fire of the brandy leapt into flame. The madness broke out in him. With a burst of its bygone fury, he sprang, screaming, to his feet. "The moon!" he shouted. "The mad watchman's moon! The mad watchman himself is coming back. There he is, sliding down on the slanting light. Do you see the brown earth of the grave dropping from him, and the rope round his neck? Ah, how he skips and twists and twirls! He's dancing again with the dead ones. Make way there. I mean to dance with them too. Come on, mad watchman, come on, I'm as mad as you are." He whirled round and round with a fancied ghost for a partner in the dance. The coarse laughter of Schwartz burst out again at the terrible sight. He called with drunken triumph to Madame Fontaine. "Look at Jackie, madam. There's a dancer for you. There's good company for a dull winter night." She neither looked nor moved. She sat crouched on the chair, spellbound with terror. Jack threw up his arms, turned giddily once or twice, and sank exhausted on the floor. "The cold of him creeps up my hands," he said, still possessed by the vision of the watchman. "He cools my eyes, he calms my heart, he stuns my head. I'm dying, 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 going back with him to the grave. Poor me, poor me." He lay hushed in a strange repose, his eyes wide open, staring up at the moon. Schwartz drained the last drop of brandy out of the flask. "Jack's name ought to be Solomon," he pronounced with drowsy solemnity. "Solomon was wise, and Jack's wise. Jack goes to sleep when the liquor's done. Take away the bottle before the overseer comes in. If any man says I am not sober, that man lies. The Rhine wine has a way of humming in one's head. That's all, Mr. Overseer, that's all. Do I see the rising sun up there in the skylight? I wish you good night. I wish you good night." He laid his heavy arms on the table, his head dropped on them. He slept. The time passed. No sound broke the silence but the lumpish snoring of Schwartz. No change appeared in Jack. There he lay, staring up at the moon. Somewhere in the building, unheard thus far in the uproar, a clock struck the first hour of the morning. Madame Fontaine started. The sound shook her with a new fear, a fear that expressed itself in a furtive look at the cell in which the dead woman lay. If the corpse bell rang, would the stroke of it be like the single stroke of the clock? "Jack," she whispered, "do you hear the clock? Oh, Jack, the stillness is dreadful. Speak to me." He slowly raised himself. Perhaps the striking of the clock, perhaps some inner prompting had roused him. He neither answered Madame Fontaine nor looked at her. With his arms clasped round his knees, he sat on the floor in the attitude of a savage. His eyes, which had stared at the moon, now stared with the same rigid, glassy look at the alarm bell over the cell door. The time went on. Again the oppression of silence became more than Madame Fontaine could endure. Again she tried to make Jack speak to her. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "What are you waiting for? Is it—" The rest of the sentence died away on her lips. The words that would finish it were words too terrible to be spoken. The sound of her voice produced no visible impression on Jack. Had it influenced him in some unseen way? Something did certainly disturb the strange torpor that held him. He spoke. The tones were slow and mechanical, the tones of a man searching his memory with pain and difficulty, repeating his recollections one by one, as he recovered them to himself. "When she moves," he muttered, "her hands pull the string. Her hands send a message up and up to the bell." He paused and pointed to the cell door. The action had a horrible suggestiveness to the guilty wretch who was watching him. "Don't do that," she cried. "Don't point there." His hand never moved. He pursued his newly found recollections of what the doctor had shown to him. "Up and up to the bell," he repeated, "and the bell feels it. The steel thing moves. The bell speaks. Good bell. Faithful bell." The clock struck the half-hour past 1. Madame Fontaine shrieked at the sound. Her senses knew no distinction between the clock and the bell. She saw his pointing hand drop back and clasp itself with the other hand round his knees. He spoke softly and tenderly now. He was speaking to the dead. "Rise, mistress, rise. Dear soul, the time is long, and poor Jack is waiting for you." She thought the closed curtains moved. The delusion was reality to her. She tried to rouse Schwartz. "Watchman! Watchman, wake up!" He slept on as heavily as ever. She half rose from her chair. She was almost on her feet when she sank back again. Jack had moved. He got up on his knees. "Mistress hears me," he said. The light of vivid expression showed itself in his eyes. Their vacancy was gone. They looked longingly at the door of the cell. He got on his feet, pressed both hands over his bosom. "Come," he said. "Oh, mistress, come." There was a sound, a faint premonitory rustling sound, over the door. The steel hammer moved, rose, struck the metal globe. The bell rang. He stood rooted to the floor, sobbing hysterically. The iron grasp of suspense held him. Not a cry, not a movement escaped Madame Fontaine. The life seemed to have been struck out of her by the stroke of the bell. It woke Schwartz. Except that he looked up, he too never moved. He too was like a living creature turned to stone. A minute passed. The curtains swayed gently. Tremulous fingers crept out, parting them. Slowly over the black surface of the curtain a fair, naked arm showed itself, widening the gap. The figure appeared in its velvet pall. On the pale face the stillness of repose was barely ruffled yet. The eyes alone were conscious of returning life. They looked out on the room, softly surprised and perplexed, no more. They looked downwards. The lips trembled sweetly into a smile. She saw Jack kneeling in ecstasy at her feet. And now again there was stillness in the room. Unutterable happiness rejoiced. Unutterable dread suffered in the same silence. The first sound heard came suddenly from the lonely outer hall. Hurrying footsteps swept over the courtyard. The flash of lights flew along the dark passage. Voices of men and women mingled together.
Postscript of Jezebel's Daughter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. Jezebel's Daughter by Wilkie Collins. Postscript. Mr. David Glennie returns to Frankfurt and closes the story. 1. On the 12th of December, I received a letter from Mrs. Wagner, informing me that the marriage of Fritz and Minna had been deferred until the 13th of January. Shortly afterwards I left London, on my way to Frankfurt. My departure was hurried, to afford me time to transact business with some of our correspondents in France and in northern Germany. Our head clerk, Mr. Hartney, directing the London house in Mrs. Wagner's absence, had his own old-fashioned notions of doing nothing in a hurry. He insisted on allowing me a far larger margin of time for treating our correspondence than I was likely to require. The good man little suspected to what motive my ready submission to him was due. I was eager to see my aunt and the charming Minna once more. Without neglecting any of my duties, and with the occasional sacrifice of travelling by night, I contrived to reach Frankfurt a week before I was expected, that is to say, in the forenoon of the 4th of January. 2. Joseph's face, when he opened the door, at once informed me that something extraordinary was going on in the house. "Anything wrong?" I asked. Joseph looked at me in a state of bewilderment. "You'd better speak to the doctor," he said. "The doctor? Who is ill? My aunt? Mr. Keller? Who is it?" In my impatience I took him by the collar of his coat and shook him. I shook out nothing but the former answer, a little abridged. "Speak to the doctor." The office door was close by me. I asked one of the clerks if Mr. Keller was in his room. The clerk informed me that Mr. Keller was upstairs with the doctor. In the extremity of my suspense, I inquired again if my aunt was ill. The man opened his eyes. "Is it possible you haven't heard?" he asked. "Is she dead or alive?" I burst out, losing all patience. "Both," answered the clerk. I began, not unnaturally I think, to wonder whether I was in Mr. Keller's house or in an asylum for idiots. Returning to the hall, I collared Joseph for the second time. "Take me up to the doctor instantly," I said. Joseph led the way upstairs, not on my aunt's side of the house, to my infinite relief. On the first landing he made a mysterious communication. "Mr. David, I have given notice to leave," he said. "There are some things that no servant can put up with. While a person lives, I expect a person to live. When a person dies, I expect a person to die. There must be no confusion on such a serious subject as life and death. I blame nobody, I understand nothing. I merely go. Follow me, if you please, sir." Had he been drinking? He led the way up the next flight of stairs steadily and quietly. He knocked discreetly at Madame Fontaine's door. "Mr. David Glenney," he announced, "to see Dr. Dormann." Mr. Keller came out first, closing the door behind him. He embraced me, with the demonstrative affection far from characteristic of him at other times. His face was disturbed, his voice faltered, as he spoke his first words to me. "Welcome back, David. More welcome than ever." "My aunt is well, I hope?" He clasped his hands fervently. "God is merciful," he said. "Thank God. Is Madame Fontaine ill?" Before we could answer, the door was opened again. Dr. Dormann came out. "The very man I want," he exclaimed. "You could not possibly have arrived at a better time." He turned to Mr. Keller. "Where can I find writing materials? In the drawing-room? Come down, Mr. Glenney. Come down, Mr. Keller." In the drawing-room he wrote a few lines rapidly. "See us sign our names," he said. He handed the pen to Mr. Keller after he had signed himself, and then gave me the paper to read. To my unspeakable amazement the writing certified that the suspended vital forces in Mrs. Wagner had recovered their action in the dead house of Frankfort at 1:30 in the morning of the 4th of January, that he had professionally superintended the restoration to life, and that he thereby relieved the magistrates from any further necessity for pursuing a private inquiry, the motive for which no longer existed. To this statement there was a line added, declaring that Mr. Keller withdrew his application to the magistrates, authenticated by Mr. Keller's signature. I stood with the paper in my hand, looking from one to the other of them, as completely bewildered as Joseph himself. "I can't leave Madame Fontaine," said the doctor. "I am professionally interested in watching the case. Otherwise I would have made my statement in person. Mr. Keller has been terribly shaken, and stands in urgent need of rest and quiet. You will do us both a service if you will take that paper to the town hall, and declare before the magistrates that you know us personally, and have seen us sign our names. On your return you shall have every explanation that I can give, and you shall see for yourself that you need feel no uneasiness on the subject of your aunt." Having arrived at the town hall, I made the personal statement to which the doctor had referred. Among the questions put to me, I was asked if I had any direct interest in the matter, either as regarded Mrs. Wagner or any other person. Having answered that I was Mrs. Wagner's nephew, I was instructed to declare in writing that I approved, as Mrs. Wagner's representative, of the doctor's statement and of Mr. Keller's withdrawal of his application. With this the formal proceedings terminated, and I was free to return to the house. 3. Joseph had his orders this time. He spoke like a reasonable being. He said the doctor was waiting for me in Madame Fontaine's room. The place of the appointment rather surprised me. The doctor opened the door, but paused before he admitted me. "I think you were the first person," he said, "who saw Mr. Keller on the morning when he was taken ill?" "After the late Mr. Engelman," I answered, "I was the first person." "Come in, then. I want you to look at Madame Fontaine." He led me to the bedside. The instant I looked at her I saw Mr. Keller's illness reproduced in every symptom. There she lay, in the same apathy, with the same wan look on her face, and the same intermittent trembling of her hands. When I recovered the first shock of the discovery, I was able to notice poor Minna, kneeling at the opposite side of the bed, weeping bitterly. "Oh, my dear one," she cried, in a passion of grief, "look at me, speak to me." The mother opened her eyes for a moment, looked at Minna, and closed them again wearily. "Leave me quiet," she said, in tones of fretful entreaty. Minna rose and bent over the pillow tenderly. "Your poor lips look so parched," she said. "Let me give you some lemonade?" Madame Fontaine only repeated the words, "Leave me quiet." The same reluctance to raise her heavy eyelids, the same entreaty to be left undisturbed which had alarmed me on the memorable morning when I had entered Mr. Keller's room. Dr. Dormann signed to me to follow him out. As he opened the door, the nurse inquired if he had any further instructions for her. "Send for me the moment you see a change," he answered. "I shall be in the drawing-room with Mr. Glennie." I silently pressed poor Minna's hand before I left her. Who could have presumed at that moment to express sympathy in words? The doctor and I descended the stairs together. "Does her illness remind you of anything?" he asked. "Of Mr. Keller's illness," I answered, "exactly as I remember it." He made no further remark. We entered the drawing-room. I inquired if I could see my aunt. "You must wait a little," he said. "Mrs. Wagner is asleep. The longer she sleeps, the more complete her recovery will be. My main anxiety is about Jack. He is quiet enough now, keeping watch outside her door, but he has given me some trouble. I wish I knew more of his early history. From all I can learn, he was only what is called half-witted, when they received him at the asylum in London. The cruel, repressive treatment in that place aggravated his imbecility into violent madness, and such madness has a tendency to recur. Mrs. Wagner's influence, which has already done so much, is my main hope for the future. Sit down and let me explain the strange position in which you find us here, as well I can. 4. "Do you remember how Mr. Keller's illness was cured?" the doctor began. Those words instantly reminded me, not only of Dr. Dormann's mysterious suspicions at the time of the illness, but of Jack's extraordinary question to me on the morning when I left Frankfort. The doctor saw that I answered him with some little embarrassment. "Let us open our minds to each other without reserve," he said. "I have set you thinking of something. What is it?" I replied, concealing nothing. Dr. Dormann was equally candid on his side. He spoke to me exactly as he is reported to have spoken to Mr. Keller in the second part of this narrative. "You now know," he proceeded, "what I thought of Mr. Keller's extraordinary recovery, and what I feared when I found Mrs. Wagner, as I then firmly believed, dead. My suspicions of poisoning pointed to the poisoner. Madame Fontaine's wonderful cure of Mr. Keller, by means of his own mysterious remedy, made me suspect Madame Fontaine. My motive in refusing to give the burial certificate was to provoke the legal inquiry, which I knew that Mr. Keller would institute on the mere expression of a doubt on my part whether your aunt had died a natural death. At that time I had not the slightest anticipation of the event that has actually occurred. Before, however, we had removed the remains to the dead house, I must own I was a little startled. Prepare yourself for surprise, by a private communication, addressed to me by Jack." He repeated Jack's narrative of the opening of the pink room cupboard, and the administration of the antidote to Mrs. Wagner. "You will understand," he went on, "that I was too well aware of the marked difference between Mr. Keller's illness and Mrs. Wagner's illness to suppose for a moment that the same poison had been given to both of them. I was therefore far from sharing Jack's blind confidence in the efficacy of the blue glass bottle in the case of his mistress. But I tell you, honestly, my mind was disturbed about it. Towards night my thoughts were again directed to the subject under mysterious circumstances. Mr. Keller and I accompanied the hearse to the dead house. On our way through the streets I was followed and stopped by Madame Fontaine. She had something to give me. Here it is." He laid on the table a sheet of thick paper, closely covered with writing in cipher. 5. "Whose writing is this?" I asked. "The writing of Madame Fontaine's late husband." "And she put it into your hands?" "Yes, and she asked me to interpret the cipher for her." "It's simply incomprehensible." "Not in the least. She knew the use to which Jack had put her antidote, and in her ignorance of chemistry she was eager to be prepared for any consequences which might follow. Can you guess on what chance I calculated when I consented to interpret the cipher?" "On the chance that it might tell you what poison she had given to Mrs. Wagner?" "Well guessed, Mr. Glennie." "And you have actually discovered the meaning of these hieroglyphics?" He laid a second sheet of paper on the table. "There is but one cipher that defies interpretation," he said. "If you and your correspondent privately arrange to consult the same edition of the same book, and if your cipher, or his, refers to a given page and to certain lines on that page, no ingenuity can discover you, unaided by a previous discovery of the book. All other ciphers, as far as I know, are at the mercy of skill and patience. In this case I began, to save time and trouble, by trying the rule for interpreting the most simple and most elementary of all ciphers, that is to say, the use of the ordinary language of correspondence concealed under arbitrary signs. The right way to read these signs can be described in 2 words. On the examination of the cipher, you will find that some signs will be more often repeated than others. Count the separate signs, and ascertain, by simple addition, which especial sign occurs oftenest, which follows next in point of number, and so on. These comparisons established, ask yourself what vowel occurs oftenest, and what consonant occurs oftenest, in the language in which you suppose the cipher to be written. The result is merely a question of time and patience. "And this is the result?" I said, pointing to the second sheet of paper. "Read it," he answered, "and judge for yourself." The opening sentence of the interpreted cipher appeared to be intended by Dr. Fontaine to serve the purpose of a memorandum, repeating privately the instructions already attached by labels to the poison called Alexander's wine, and to its antidote. The paragraphs that followed were of a far more interesting kind. They alluded to the second poison, called the looking-glass drops, and they related the result of one of the professor's most remarkable experiments in the following words. 6. The looking-glass drops. Fatal dose, as discovered by experiments on animals, the same as in the case of Alexander's wine, but the effect, in producing death, more rapid and more indistinguishable, in respect of presenting traces on post-mortem examination. After many patient trials, I can discover no trustworthy antidote to this infernal poison. Under these circumstances, I dare not attempt to modify it for medical use. I would throw it away, but I don't like to be beaten. If I live a little longer, I will try once more, with my mind refreshed by other studies. A month after writing these lines, which I have repeated in plain characters on the bottle for fear of accidents, I tried again, and failed again. Annoyed by this new disappointment, I did something unworthy of me as a scientific man. After first poisoning an animal with the looking-glass drops, I administered a drop from the blue bottle containing the antidote to Alexander's wine, knowing perfectly well the different nature of the 2 poisons, expecting nothing of any scientific importance to follow, and yet trusting stupidly to chance to help me. The result was startling in the last degree. It was nothing less than the complete suspension of all the signs of life as we know them for a day and a night and part of another day. I only knew that the animal was not really dead by observing, on the morning of the second day, that no signs of decomposition had set in, the season being summer and the laboratory badly ventilated. An hour after the first symptoms of revival had astonished me, the creature was as lively again as usual, and ate with a good appetite. After a lapse of 10 days, it was still in perfect health. This extraordinary example of the action and reaction of the ingredients of the poison and the ingredients of the antidote on each other, and on the sources of life, deserves, and shall have, the most careful investigation. May I live to carry the inquiry through to some good use, and to record it on another page. There was no other page, and no further record. The professor's last scientific aspiration had not been fulfilled. 7. It was past midnight, said the doctor, when I made the discovery with which you are now acquainted. I went at once to Mr. Keller. He had fortunately not gone to bed, and he accompanied me to the dead-house. Knowing the overseer's private door at the side of the building, I was able to rouse him with very little delay. In the excitement that possessed me, I spoke of the revival as a possible thing in the hearing of the servants. The whole household accompanied us to the dead-house, at the opposite extremity of the building. What we saw there I am utterly incapable of describing to you. I was in time to take the necessary measures for keeping Mrs. Wagner composed, and for removing her without injury to Mr. Keller's house. Having successfully accomplished this, I presumed that my anxieties were at an end. I was completely mistaken. You refer to Madame Fontaine, I suppose? No, I refer to Jack. The poor wretch's ignorant faith had unquestionably saved his mistress's life. I should never have ventured, even if I had been acquainted with the result of the professor's experiment at an earlier hour, to run the desperate risk which Jack confronted without hesitation. The events of the night, aggravated by the brandy that Schwartz had given to him, had completely overthrown the balance of his feeble brain. He was as mad, for the time being, as ever he could have been in Bedlam. With some difficulty I prevailed on him to take a composing mixture. He objected irritably to trust me, and, even when the mixture had begun to quiet him, he was ungrateful enough to speak contemptuously of what I had done for him. I had a much better remedy than yours, he said, made by a man who was worth 100 of you. Schwartz and I were fools enough to give it to Mrs. Housekeeper last night. I thought nothing of this. It was one of the eccentricities which were to be expected from him in his condition. I left him quietly asleep, and I was about to go home and get a little rest myself, when Mr. Keller's son stopped me in the hall. "Do go and see Madame Fontaine," he said. "Minna is alarmed about her mother." I went upstairs again directly. "Had you noticed anything remarkable in Madame Fontaine?" I asked, "before Fritz spoke to you?" I noticed at the dead house that she had looked frightened out of her senses, and I was a little surprised, holding the opinion I did of her, that such a woman should show so much sensibility. Mr. Keller took charge of her on our way back to the house. I was quite unprepared for what I saw afterwards, when I went to her room at Fritz's request. "Did you discover the resemblance to Mr. Keller's illness?" "No, not till afterwards. She sent her daughter out of the room, and I thought she looked at me strangely when we were alone. 'I want the paper I gave you in the street last night,' she said. I asked her why she wanted it. She seemed not to know how to reply. She became excited and confused. 'To destroy it, to be sure,' she burst out suddenly. 'Every bottle my husband left is destroyed, strewed here, there, and everywhere, from the gate to the dead house. Oh, I know what you think of me. I defy you!' She seemed to forget what she had said the moment she had said it. She turned away and opened a drawer and took out a book closed by metal clasps. My presence in the room appeared to be a lost perception in her mind. The clasps of the book, as well as I could make it out, opened by touching some spring. I noticed that her hands trembled as they tried to find the spring. I attributed the trembling to the terrors of the night, and offered to help her. 'Let my secrets alone,' she said, and pushed the book under the pillow of her bed. It was my professional duty to assist her if I could. Though I attached no sort of importance to what Jack had said, I thought it desirable, before I prescribed for her, to discover whether she had really taken some medicine of her own or not. She staggered back from me, on my repeating what I had heard from Jack, as if I had terrified her. 'What remedy does he mean? I drank nothing but a glass of wine. Send for him directly. I must and will speak to him.' I told her this was impossible. I could not permit her sleep to be disturbed. 'The watchman!' she cried. 'The drunken brute! Send for him!' By this time I began to conclude that there was really something wrong. I called in her daughter to look after her while I was away, and then left the room to consult with Fritz. The only hope of finding Schwartz, the night watch at the dead house being over by that time, was to apply to his sister, the nurse. I knew where she lived, and Fritz most kindly offered to go to her. By the time Schwartz was found, and brought to the house, Madame Fontaine was just able to understand what he said, and no more. I began to recognize the symptoms of Mr. Keller's illness. The apathy which you remember was showing itself already. 'Leave me to die,' she said quietly. 'I deserve it.' The last effort of the distracted mind, rousing for a moment the sinking body, was made almost immediately afterwards. She raised herself on the pillow and seized my arm. 'Mind,' she said. 'Minna is to be married on the 13th. Her eyes rested steadily on me while she spoke. At the last word she sank back and relapsed into the condition in which you have just seen her." "Can you do nothing for her?" "Nothing. Our modern science is absolutely ignorant of the poisons which Professor Fontaine's fatal ingenuity revived. Slow poisoning by reiterated doses, in small quantities, we understand. But slow poisoning by one dose is so extremely beyond our experience, that medical men in general refuse to believe in it." "Are you sure that she is poisoned?" I asked. "After what Jack told me this morning when he woke, I have no doubt she is poisoned by Alexander's wine. She appears to have treacherously offered it to him as a remedy, and to have hesitated, at the last moment, to let him have it. As a remedy, Jack's ignorant faith gave it to her by the hands of Schwartz. When we have more time before us, you shall hear all the details. In the meanwhile, I can only tell you that the retribution is complete. Madame Fontaine might even now be saved, if Jack had not given all that remained of the antidote to Mrs. Wagner." "Is there any objection to my asking Jack for the particulars?" "The strongest possible objection. It is of the utmost importance to discourage him from touching on the subject in the future. He has already told Mrs. Wagner that he has saved her life, and just before you came in I found him comforting Minna. Your mamma has taken her own good medicine, missy. She will soon get well. I have been obliged, God forgive me, to tell your aunt and Minna that he is misled by insane delusions, and that they are not to believe one word of what he has said to them." "No doubt your motive justifies you," I said, not penetrating his motive at the moment. "You will understand me directly," he answered. "I trust to your honor under any circumstances. Why have I taken you into my confidence under these circumstances? For a very serious reason, Mr. David. You are likely to be closely associated, in the time to come, with your aunt and Minna, and I look to you to help the good work which I have begun. Mrs. Wagner's future life must not be darkened by a horrible recollection. That sweet girl must enjoy the happy years that are in store for her, unembittered by the knowledge of her mother's guilt. Do you understand now why I am compelled to speak unjustly of poor Jack? As a proof that I understood him, I promised the secrecy which he had every right to expect from me. The entrance of the nurse closed our conference. She reported Madame Fontaine's malady to be already altering for the worse. The doctor watched the case. At intervals, I too saw her again. Although it happened long ago, I cannot prevail upon myself to dwell on the deliberate progress of the hellish Borgia poison in undermining the forces of life. The nervous shudderings reached their climax, and then declined as gradually as they had arisen. For hours afterward she lay in a state of complete prostration. Not a last word, not a last look, rewarded the devoted girl, watching faithfully at the bedside. No more of it, no more. Late in the afternoon of the next day, Dr. Dormann, gently, most gently, removed Minna from the room. Mr. Keller and I looked at each other in silence. We knew that Madame Fontaine was dead. 8. I had not forgotten the clasped book that she had tried vainly to open, in Dr. Dormann's presence. Taking it myself from under the pillow, I left Mr. Keller and the doctor to say if I should give it, unopened, to Minna. "Certainly not," said the doctor. "Why not?" "Because it will tell her what she must never know. I believe that book to be a diary. Open it and see." I found the spring and opened the clasps. It was a diary. "You judged, I suppose, from the appearance of the book?" I said. "Not at all. I judged from my own experience at the time when I was medical officer at the prison here. An educated criminal is almost invariably an inveterate egotist. We are all interesting to ourselves, but the more vile we are, the more intensely we are absorbed in ourselves. The very people who have, logically speaking, the most indisputable interest in concealing their crimes, are also the very people who, almost without exception, yield to the temptation of looking at themselves in the pages of a diary. I don't doubt your experience, doctor, but your results puzzle me. Think a little, Mr. David, and you will not find the riddle so very hard to read. The better we are, the more unselfishly we are interested in others. The worse we are, the more inveterately our interest is concentrated on ourselves. Look at your aunt as an example of what I say. This morning there were some letters waiting for her, on the subject of those reforms in the treatment of mad people, which she is as resolute as ever to promote, in this country as well as in England. It was with the greatest difficulty that I prevailed on her not to answer those letters just yet. In other words, not to excite her brain and nervous system after such an ordeal as she has just passed through. Do you think a wicked woman, with letters relating merely to the interests of other people waiting for her, would have stood in any need of my interference? Not she. The wicked woman would have thought only of herself, and would have been far too much interested in her own recovery to run the risk of a relapse. Open that book of Madame Fontaine's at any of the later entries. You'll find the miserable woman self-betrayed in every page. It was true. Every record of Madame Fontaine's most secret moments, presented in this narrative, was first found in her diary. As an example, her diary records, in the fullest detail, the infernal ingenuity of the stratagem by which she usurped her title to Mr. Keller's confidence as the preserver of his life. "I have only to give him the Alexander's wine," she writes, "to make sure, by means of the antidote, of curing the illness which I have myself produced. After that, Minna's mother becomes Mr. Keller's guardian angel, and Minna's marriage is a certainty." On a later page she is similarly self-described, in Mrs. Wagner's case, as acting from an exactly opposite motive in choosing the looking-glass drops. "They not only kill soonest, and most surely defy detection," she proceeds, "but I have it on the authority of the label that my husband has tried to find the antidote to these drops, and has tried in vain. If my heart fails me when the deed is done, there can be no reprieve for the woman whose tongue I must silence forever, or, after all that I have sacrificed, my child's future is ruined." There is little doubt that she intended to destroy these compromising pages on her return to Mr. Keller's house, and that she would have carried out her intention but for those first symptoms of the poison, which showed themselves in the wandering of her mind and the helpless trembling of her hands. The final entry in the diary has an interest of its own, which I think justifies the presentation of it in this place. It shows the purifying influence of the maternal instinct in a wicked nature, surviving to the last. Even Madame Fontaine's nature preserved, in this way, a softer side. On the memorable occasion of her meeting with Mr. Keller in the hall, she had acted as imprudently as if she had been the most foolish woman living, in her eagerness to plead Minna's cause with the man on whom Minna's marriage depended. She had shrunk from poisoning harmless Jack, even for her own protection. She would not even seduce Minna into telling a lie, when a lie would have served them both at the most critical moments of their lives. Are such redeeming features unnatural in an otherwise wicked woman? Think of your own inconsistencies. Read these last words of a sinner, and thank God that you were not tempted as she was. Sent Minna out of my room and hurt my sensitive girl cruelly. I am afraid of her. This last crime seems to separate me from that pure creature all the more because it has been committed in her dearest interests, and for her sweet sake. Every time she looks at me I am afraid she may see what I have done for her in my face. Oh, how I long to take her in my arms and devour her with kisses. I daren't do it. I daren't do it. Lord, have mercy on her, miserable sinner. 9. The night is getting on, and the lamp I am writing by grows dim. My mind wanders away from Frankfort and from all that once happened there. The picture now in my memory presents an English scene. I am at the house of business in London. 2 friends are waiting for me. One of them is Fritz. The other is the most popular person in the neighborhood, a happy, harmless creature, known to everyone by the undignified nickname of Jack Straw. Thanks to my aunt's influence and to the change of scene, no return of the relapse at Frankfort has shown itself. We are easy about the future of our little friend. As to the past, we have made no romantic discoveries relating to the earlier years of Jack's life. Who were his parents, whether they died or whether they deserted him, how he lived and what he suffered, before he drifted into the service of the chemistry professor at Wurzburg. These and other questions like them remain unanswered. Jack himself feels no sort of interest in our inquiries. He either will not or cannot rouse his feeble memory to help us. What does it matter now, he says. I began to live when mistress first came to see me. I don't remember and won't remember anything before that. So the memoirs of Jack remain unwritten, for want of materials, like the memoirs of many another foundling in real life. While I am speaking of Jack, I am keeping my 2 friends waiting in the reception room. I dress myself in my best clothes and join them. Fritz is silent and nervous, unreasonably impatient for the arrival of the carriage at the door. Jack promenades the room, with a superb nosegay in the buttonhole of a glorious blue coat. He has a watch, he carries a cane, he wears white gloves, and tight nankeen pantaloons. He struts out before us when the carriage comes at last. I don't deny that Fritz is a figure in the festival, he says when we drive away, but I positively assert that the thing is not complete without me. If my dress fails in any respect to do me justice, for heaven's sake mention it, one of you, before we pass the tailor's door. I answered Jack by telling him that he is in all respects perfect. And Jack answers me, David, you have your faults, but your taste is invariably correct. Give me a little more room. I can't face mistress with crumpled coat-tails. We reach a little village in the neighborhood of London, and stop at the gate of the old church. We walk up to the altar rails and wait there. All the women in the place are waiting also. They merely glance at Fritz and at me. Their whole attention is concentrated on Jack. They take him for the bridegroom. Jack discovers it, and is better pleased with himself than ever. The organist plays a wedding march. The bride, simply and unpretendingly dressed, just fluttered enough to make her eyes irresistible and her complexion lovely, enters the church, leaning on Mr. Keller's arm. Our good partner looks younger than usual. At his own earnest request, the business in Frankfort has been sold, the head partner first stipulating for the employment of a given number of reputable young women in the office. Removed from associations which are inexpressibly repellent to him, Mr. Keller is building a house, near Mrs. Wagner's pretty cottage, on the hill above the village. Here he proposes to pass the rest of his days peacefully, with his 2 married children. On their way to the altar, Mr. Keller and Minna are followed by Dr. Dormann, taking his annual holiday this year in England. The doctor gives his arm to the woman of all women whom Jack worships and loves. My kind and dear aunt, with the old bright charm in her face, the firm friend of all friendless creatures, why does my calmness desert me, when I try to draw my little portrait of her, Minna's second mother, standing by Minna's side, on the greatest day of her life? I can't even see the paper. Nearly 50 years have passed since that wedding day. Oh, my coevals, who have outlived your dearest friends, like me, you know what is the matter with my eyes. I must take out my handkerchief and put down my pen.